what I'm going to try to do is give a little bit of a feel for the kinds of things that people who study language find really interesting, and hopefully just get the audience here excited about some of those kinds of questions and maybe get them to think about how you might be able to study these things. So there are a lot of reasons to study language. Language allows us to share information with each other. It allows us to cooperate and do things that we never could on our own. If you think about all of the incredible cultural achievements that we have, none of them would be possible if we weren't able to communicate with each other. Language allows us to transmit information across time and space. And if we have something like a writing system, it even lets us do that in a very lasting way, right? That persists across many, many generations and maybe across civilizations. And another reason to study language that is especially sort of dear to my heart, because I study language development, is that we're born with this urge to learn and use language. And little kids learn language and know language better by age 3 or 4 than really the most sophisticated computers that anyone can currently build. And if you have kids, or if you think about what, if you know any 3 and 4-year-olds, you think about all of the things that they can and can't do, it's a really incredible achievement, right? I mean, these are kids who you wouldn't trust to cross the road on their own. And yet they're speaking and understanding in a way that we really can't program even our best machines to do, right? And so what I want to talk about a little bit today is just what is the knowledge of language like? I think the interesting observation, at least one observation that I find really interesting, is that we all know a lot about language, even when we don't realize what we know. And in particular, we know rules that govern how the language that we speak works. And when I say rules, I'm not really talking about the kinds of things that you learn in school, right? So maybe you remember when you had a language class in school, you learned things like, the teacher might write out a sentence and ask you to identify the nouns or the verbs in the sentence. So you learned how to do that. Or sometimes you'd get rules that prescribe how you should read or how you should talk, like things like don't end a sentence with a preposition, right? Probably most people have heard that kind of advice. Well, that's the kind of rule I don't believe in. I'm not talking about these sorts of prescriptive rules. I'm talking about rules that describe what you know just by virtue of being a fluent speaker of a language. And so we all have a ton of linguistic intuitions that seem to reflect these kinds of rules. So for example, if I ask you, which one of the following two is just an English sentence? Who is that versus that who is, right? Everybody listening to this talk knows what the answer to that question is, right? That who is just not a reasonable sentence in English. Here's an example of a slightly more subtle distinction or slightly more subtle rule. If I say I don't know anything about language at all, that sounds like a pretty good sentence. But compare that to if I say I know anything about language at all. Any native speaker of English hearing that sentence is going to go, that doesn't sound quite right. And so the question is, how do you know that that doesn't sound quite right? What kind of knowledge do you have that allows you to make that kind of decision or that kind of judgment? And so if you think about language as really just a kind of collection of rules that we somehow know, we know to follow them, and we can recognize them when we hear them or when we hear them being not followed, being violated. And we know that just by growing up around people who speak our language, then you can understand what kinds of different questions that scientists who study language might ask. So linguists study what those rules are. They try to give the best description of those rules. Psycholinguists or psychologists of language, which I sort of count myself most closely affiliated with, study how we know what those rules are. So if you're interested in language acquisition or language learning, you study how children learn those rules. And if you're interested in adult language, you might study how we remember or recall or use those rules on the fly while we're speaking and listening. And then, of course, there's cognitive neuroscientists who study, if we think of the brain as a computer, how does the hardware of the brain support and run the software of language? How does it implement all of those rules that we know? And then there's even computer scientists, right, who study how do we program all of that software, all of those rules, into a computer. So if you're Siri or your Alexa or your Google Home device, can understand the rules of language the same way that you do, then they might be able to understand you and talk to you better. Okay, so I just want to give you a little bit more of a flavor for the kinds of rules that you know. Here's a really lovely example, a really lovely little quote. It's about something called Hyperbaton. And Hyperbaton is when you put words in an odd order. And that's very, very difficult to do in English. So given that almost everything else in the English language is slapdash, happy-go-lucky, care may the devil, word order is surprisingly strict. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, who of course wrote The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, he wrote his first story when he was 7 years old, and it was about a green great dragon. He showed it to his mother, who told him that you absolutely could not have a green great dragon, and that it had to be a great green one instead. Now, Tolkien was so disheartened that he never wrote another story for years. Of course, lucky for us, he did end up writing some other stories. So the point there is that adjectives in English absolutely have to be in the following order: opinion, then size, then age, then shape, then color, then origin, then material, then purpose, and then the noun. So for example, you can have a lovely little old rectangular green French silver whittling knife. But if you mess with that word order in the slightest, you're going to sound like a maniac. And it's an odd thing that every English speaker uses that list, but almost none of us could write it out or report it, right? Report that we use it. So we have complex knowledge that's reflected in these intuitions about what sounds good and what doesn't, what counts as English or whichever language we're speaking in and what doesn't. And one question that I'm really interested in is just how do we learn this, right? No one ever explicitly taught us that. Nobody sits down with you if you're a native English speaker and teaches you what order adjectives should go in. And so what does it mean then to know those rules if you can't actually say what they are? And I'll just give a little bit of a plug for my lab at Brown University. We study these sorts of things. So we study what language rules adults know and how they know them, and we study how kids learn them. And in particular, we're always looking for participants in our studies, especially families with kids. Right now, all of our studies are online over Zoom. And I think a link is about to go out that will direct you to where you can sign up and participate if you have little kids. And actually, it doesn't have to be little. We study kids all the way from infants all the way up to teenagers. Okay, and of course, we also hope to be able to welcome you in person at our lab at Brown before too long. All right.
You're muted, Pablo.
Oh, there you go. No, not anymore. So I have a question that happens to me all the time. I'm bilingual. I speak Spanish and English. But what I find is that when I speak, I sometimes am applying the rules of Spanish to my word order. And I had to consciously, work at not doing that. But yet when I write, I don't run into the same issues.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah. So let me actually circle back to your question about whether being a bilingual makes you smarter, right? So the idea is this is actually a really controversial and interesting area of research. So there's been a lot of evidence that it does, in a general way, make you smarter, just outside of knowing two languages. And there's also been some evidence that it doesn't. And I would say the research is not settled. So we just don't know right now. There's more work to be done. One reason why it might is exactly the experience that you report, right? So the idea is that when you're a bilingual, you have to do exactly this kind of conscious work. You have to figure out which one of the languages that you speak you should be deploying at any given time, right? Like if you're speaking to somebody else who speaks Spanish, you have to decide, I'm going to use Spanish to talk to them and not English, right? And so the idea is that
that's another layer.
Or Spanglish. Yeah, right. And so you can even mix them together, right? And bilingual communities, you'll see that kind of mixing emerging all over the place, right? If you have an entire community of speakers of both English and Spanish, that's where you get these sorts of Spanglish kind of phenomena, because everybody knows that everybody else will be able to understand them if they kind of mix the two, right? Yeah, exactly. So so the reason why being a bilingual might make you smarter is that basically, Pablo, you more than a monolingual, have to practice doing this kind of cognitive control, right? You have to constantly be doing this whenever you're speaking to someone, to a new person. And the idea is that maybe this kind of cognitive control generalizes, right? Maybe if you practice doing it for language, then you'll also be better at doing it for things that aren't language, right? That's been controversial. It just turns out that it's really, really hard to tell whether it really generalizes or not. It's hard to do the studies, right? In general, bilinguals are really, really tricky to study. Because with most bilinguals, they're more proficient in one language than the other. And so, it's kind of hard to tell what it means if there's transfer effects from one to the other. Like let's say if your English is different from a monolingual's English, well, is that actually because you're a little bit less proficient in English because you've spent some of your life learning Spanish? Or is that because you also know this other language? It turns out that those things are really, really hard to tease apart in a kind of carefully controlled research context.
So to me, it sounds like what you're talking about is cognitive flexibility, right? The ability to shift between sets of rules, which is something that we can study. So I wonder, have there been studies on cognitive flexibility that has nothing to do with proficiency in a language, that is maybe more, a different type of task in bilinguals compared to monolinguals?
Yeah, exactly. So yes, and that's sort of where the controversy is. So there's some positive results, there's a bunch of other negative results. It's sort of, the short answer is it depends on exactly which tasks you look at, and exactly which tests you do. Some of them show this effect, others don't. And then there's, scientists get into arguments about maybe the cases where you see these effects are kind of cherry picked. It's not really clear how broadly it generalizes. So the short answer is it's kind of a messy.
Right. Yeah. Because I guess that the idea, and it's the same with dance and music, right, is the idea that you're engaging areas of the brain that are also used for other things, in performing that task. So, I guess, like you say, we don't know, and that's likely because within these areas of the brain, there are different populations of cells that support different functions, and whether or not they overlap is where the big question is now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess the biggest thing I'll say is that I think people often really get kind of focused on this question of like, does being bilingual make you better at other stuff? And this is why I sort of half jokingly gave you this answer in the beginning. Is like, well, whether it makes you better at other stuff or not, it makes you bilingual, right? And that's pretty amazing. It gives you access to an entire other culture, to literature and music, right? That's, I think, really not to be discounted. So there are lots of advantages to being bilingual or to raising bilingual children, whether or not being bilingual makes you smarter in other ways.
Are some languages more rigid than others? Because, for example, in Spanish, we could have 25 different words to describe one thing. And I can't seem to find the same examples in English when I'm trying to be poetic about something. Likewise, in Spanish, we tend to be more euphemistic in our expressions, and sometimes I do it in English to my wife, who is an English speaker, and she has no idea what I'm talking about.
This is why Shakira songs do not sound well in English.
Exactly.
Oh, wow, that's news to me. I thought they did, but I can't appreciate them in Spanish. So yeah, so different languages have their own kind of evolutionary history, right? Different languages have changed in different ways over time. And so some of them kind of grew these metaphors that changed, that maybe are separate from the kinds of metaphors that other languages have. I wouldn't say any language is sort of on average richer or less flexible or more flexible than another. It really just kind of depends what in particular aspect of language we're talking about. I would say a reasonable generalization is when speakers of a language have a reason to make a lot of really fine-grained distinctions, that language or that culture will have more words for those distinctions. So, you might have heard about how, this is called, in linguistics, it's called the Great Eskimo Hoax. You might have heard about how Eskimos or Inuits have lots of different words for snow, right? Well, here's another example of who has lots of different words for snow. Skiers, right? English-speaking skiers have like 30 different words for snow. As a skier, I can tell you there's slush, and there's muck, and there's crud, and there's powder, and there's chowder, and there's, I can keep going, right? There's a ton of these different distinctions. Yeah, and so the point is people will invent words to express whatever it is that they need to talk about. And entire linguistic communities will do that depending on their needs. And when enough people do it, it becomes kind of crystallized into the form of the language itself, right? So if a culture has a really rich tradition of kind of poetic speech, right, or poetry or metaphor, then a lot of that will pervade the language, and you'll get languages with these kinds of rich expressions, right?
That makes me think of language from an evolutionary perspective, right? You know, we say that language is unique to humans because our language can describe new things and it has these, you know, grammatical structures that you talked about. But why do you think that? First of all, what do you consider language in terms of other species? Songbirds, for instance, have very complex patterns that they use for mating. And how do, you know, what does that say about human language? How did it evolve? Where did it come from?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is like the $1 million question, right? So nobody knows where language evolved from or how it happened or when exactly it happened or where it happened. We kind of have a sense that like 30,000 years ago, approximately, something happened. Because after that, not too long after that, we start getting evidence of, you know, lots of different technologies and lots of different cave art and things that we generally associate with kind of more contemporary human societies that we imagine might have been done with the help of language, with the help of people being able to communicate with each other, right? So like, for example, if you're going to have generations of people making complex tools, well, probably you have people teaching each other how to do that. And how are they teaching each other how to do that? Maybe it's with the help of language at that point, right? But what exactly happened there, I don't think we know. So there has been exactly this research program that you describe of trying to compare what it is that humans can do with what it is that other animals can do. And I would say that the short answer of that from that program is you can absolutely teach a bunch of different animals, ranging from primates to dogs and other pets. You can teach them individual words for things, right? And that's, you know, if anybody owns a dog, that's not so crazy. Like, you tell your dog to sit and they kind of know what that means. They sit, right? The thing that it seems like is really hard to teach animals to do, and maybe not possible, is exactly these sorts of implicit rules that I was just talking about, right? So how to combine words together in a systematic way, what the difference is, right, between like I want food and food want I and want food I. There are a lot of examples of, for example, chimpanzees who are what's called language trained, which means, you know, they worked for many, many decades, often with a trainer who was teaching them these sorts of linguistic patterns. And what they learn are these individual words. What they don't learn is, you know, the rule structure for like, here are good ways to put them together, here are bad ways to put them together, right? And this is, again, something that, you know, a 3-year-old kid has almost mastered, right? Pretty much effortlessly without explicitly trying to do that. And so there's got to be something in, you know, the architecture of our brains that enables humans to do this kind of learning, and only humans, as far as we can tell, to do this kind of learning. Now, you're absolutely right that, for example, songbirds have really complex song patterns, but they don't seem to be as flexible as human language. So as far as we can tell, songbirds are learning kind of very specific patterns of song. They're not productively recombining those, right? So one thing that I didn't mention that's also amazing about language is its productivity, right? We can take familiar words that we know and, using these sorts of rules that we know as well, put them together in new ways to express new thoughts, right? Like the sentence I just said, that was an example of putting together familiar words in a complex new way, right? And so those are things that songbirds don't seem to do in the same way as humans, or nearly sort of as elaborately as humans. So it seems like, yeah, humans really are the only ones who do this kind of language. You know, what counts as language and whether songbirds have it or whether chimpanzees have it, it often ends up kind of coming down to terminology, like coming down to what you're willing to call language or not. But I think there's no doubt that the kind, like if you want to call that language, that's okay. But the kind of language that is very, very different than the kind of language that humans have.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question in the Q&A. Yeah, so there's a question in the Q&A about, I believe they're native English speaker, but have learned Russian and Spanish, and they found themselves translating between Russian and Spanish rather than using the English as an intermediary. And he wondered if they wondered if this was something common, and if you can speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's common because this is an issue that could only arise with trilinguals, right? And there isn't all that much research on trilinguals, partly because they're hard to find, and partly because all of the kind of difficulties of studying bilinguals are amplified with trilinguals, right? But I don't think it's uncommon. I mean, I will say, like, as a trilingual, I have this kind of experience, right? So English is the third language I learned, but these days it's the one that I use by far the most often. And so I find myself thinking, mostly in English. And then when I have to, I find myself translating things from Russian to English, even though Russian is my native language. It's the one that I learned first, long before I learned English. And so I think this is actually like really, really common. And I would guess that what was happening, at least at that time, is that you were speaking a lot of Spanish, right? You were practicing Spanish a lot. And so that made the Spanish really kind of highly relevant, highly salient in your head, highly practiced. And so whatever is the thing that you're tending to think about a lot at that moment, it makes sense that would be kind of the medium into which you would translate. But in terms of actual studies, I wish I could tell you more. There just isn't enough research on trilingual speakers.
So you should go submit yourself for a research study.
Absolutely.
That is correct. Well, we run out of time, and we could speak about this forever. And really, thank you very much, Roman, for your time and for your words. I feel smarter anyway.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.